Okay. Well, today I'd like to try to accomplish a couple of things. One is we'll go over and review the next assignment that's going to be for the Proverbs passage. We'll review a little bit parallelism. If you remember that, talk a little bit about that for the assignments, and make sure you don't have any, see if you have any questions or anything. And then also too, I sent out a message a little bit earlier today just about assignments and things like that. So I just wanted to go over that briefly toward the end of our time together and just make sure everybody's clear and if there's any questions on that as well. Okay. So with that, let me head over to, again, what I'd like to try to accomplish today is to look at assignment 3:16 and also 3:8, which is the parallelism analysis of the poem. So assignment 3:8 is the parallelism assignment for your Psalm passage, and assignment 3.16 is the assignment you have for your parallelism for your Proverbs passage. And so before we do that, wanted to just review a couple of things. Been a little bit of time since we talked about parallelism, so I wanted to take a moment and review that with you. If you want to get more details, I'll refer you back to, there's 4 sessions in particular that you can go back to, especially sessions 3.2 to 3.4. And again, you can access the videos if you go on to Canvas, as I showed you a week or two ago. And if you go on to Canvas, again, you can, I'll just do that real quick. So if you, let me share that. So if you're gonna log into Canvas, again, tmai.instructure.com. And then once you get onto there, you'll just select the module 3, if it's going to come up or not here. There we go. So you'll select module 3, and then of course the large font there in the middle of the page, just hit that. And again, that gives you the access to all of the information for this module, for this course. So here it's got for every session, the videos, the handouts, and if there's an assignment. So you go to session 3.2, 3.3, 3.4, if you can see that here. There's the video and the notes, class notes. So there we talk about parallelism in detail. We look at examples and things like that. So you can go right on those particular sessions to get the specific review for this when you're doing your assignment. But I thought I would at least do a brief overview here just to remind us of some of the key principles about parallelism and how we would do the assignment. So remember, parallelism is a basic characteristic of Hebrew poetry. It's one of the 3 fundamental characteristics. Remember, Hebrew poetry has terseness, parallel structure, including parallelism, and also imagery. And that includes figurative language. So those are the 3 basic characteristics. So parallelism really is a way that the Hebrew poets used to relay an idea or a thought. In a particular verse, they would have the 2 lines connected together in some way, relate to one another in some way. Sometimes 3 lines, sometimes 4 lines, usually 2 lines, and they have a relationship with one another. They're connected to one another in some way. Most of the verses you will encounter in the Psalms and in the Proverbs contain parallelism. Now, there are other types of Hebrew poetry, like in prophetic texts. They use a lot of poetic language, but in those passages, parallelism is not as commonly used, but it's definitely common in Psalms and Proverbs. So when you guys do your assignments, almost every verse is going to have some form of parallelism associated with it. And again, this is just a way that the poets would express a principle in a more emotional or figurative way by having the two lines within the verse connect, have some sort of relationship with one another. All right, some parallel idea being expressed. And so most verses, again, in Psalms and Proverbs contain parallelism, and there are several distinct types of parallelism in Hebrew poetry. And I'm hoping this is just review. Hopefully this will stir your mind and remind you of what we have talked about in the past. But we have the most common type of parallelism is synonymous parallelism. And that is where the second line essentially repeats the first line, but synonyms are used. So it's not the exact same words used, but the second line uses synonyms and expresses the idea in a way that matches the first line. So for example, Proverbs 3:17, her ways, this is speaking of wisdom, her ways are pleasant ways, and all her paths are peace. Now notice the synonyms here. Her ways in line 1, her paths in line 2. And then the verb are in line 1, are in line 2, and then pleasant ways in line 1, and that is parallel to peace in line 2. So we see here, these are synonymous. It's expressing the same idea in the second line as in the first, and here synonyms are used. So notice it's grammatically equivalent, subject, verb, object, and the verb is a verb of being. And then there are synonyms, ways, paths, pleasant ways, peace. Okay, so that's an example of synonymous parallelism, probably the most common type that we encounter in Hebrew poetry. All right, and then another example, day to day pours forth speech, night to night reveals knowledge. So notice here we have day to day and then night to night. Now, those are not synonyms. Obviously, day and night are different, but it's still this idea, there's still a synonymous parallel idea there, because notice it says day to day pours forth speech, night to night reveals knowledge. Speech is similar to knowledge. So again, these aren't exact synonyms always, but they portray the same idea in a similar way. All right, so even though it's saying day to day pours forth speech, that is still synonymous with night to night reveals knowledge. Even though we're talking about day and night, it's still presenting parallel idea here. So not only is the idea repeated in the same line, but again, the grammatical form. You have the subject, day to day, subject, night to night, pours forth. It's an active, in the active voice, it's an action, pours forth speech, and in the second line, reveals, again, an active mood or an active voice. Okay? Any questions on synonymous parallelism, these two examples? Hopefully that's familiar to you. Hopefully this is just, oh yeah, I think I remember that now. So synonymous parallelism. And then we have, of course, the, here's another one. Now here I'm going to have, I'll ask Pastor Allen first on this one, just give some feedback. So Allen, can you identify what are the synonyms? What are the connected words here in each of these two lines?
The evil will bow down before the good, and the wicked at the gates of the righteous. The evil, the wicked.
Yep. So those are synonymous, actually, right? So the evil and the wicked.
And there's an ellipsis, I think.
Ah, well, yeah, I noticed it here. Yes. Notice that the second line has implied the same action, right? Even though it's not given explicitly, It's assumed to be there. Okay, otherwise the second line wouldn't make any sense, right? The wicked what at the gates of the righteous? So it's assumed that it's the same verbal idea. And again, yeah, as Alan noted, ellipsis is that poetic practice where the author will leave out, he won't put the actual words in, but they're assumed to be there. And he does that for the sake of brevity, of terseness. So, okay, I'm sorry. So go ahead, Alan. What else is?
Before, at the gates.
Okay, so before, we'll just combine it. Before the good.
At the gates of the righteous.
Yes. And then, of course, we'll bow down. It's elated here, but assumed to be there. So notice in this case, we still have synonymous parallelism, even though the second line is missing a few words because they are implied, assumed to be there in the action being expressed by the poet, all right? So keep that in mind as well. Sometimes you will have ellipsis where some words will be missing within one of the lines, usually the second line in this case. Okay, good, thank you. All right, so similar to synonymous, but sort of the opposite of it is contrastive. And that is where the second line contrasts the first line. Again, though, there's a synonymous idea, but they're being contrasted. So for example, the house here and the tent of the wicked, notice, of the upright, will be, I'll just do the whole thing, will be destroyed, will flourish. Okay, what do we notice here? Well, house and tent, those are synonymous, right? A house is similar idea as a tent. But notice now we have a contrast, wicked versus upright. Okay, those aren't the same, right? But they are sort of the opposite of one another. And then we have will be destroyed and will flourish. And those are opposite ideas. To be destroyed is the opposite of flourish, okay? So here, this is contrasted, meaning that there's still a synonymous idea in that the house of the wicked will be destroyed is parallel to the tent of the upright will flourish, but they're presenting a contrast idea. In the synonymous, they're presenting the same idea, repeating the same thing really. But in contrastive, the second line contrasts the first. And in the translation, often they'll put the conjunction but there to make that clear. All right. So this is contrastive. Again, you'll see a similar form of grammar. You'll see words that are connected to each other. And in this case, you'll see several of the words won't be synonyms. They'll be what we call antonyms, okay? Antonym. Synonym is the same or similar to. Antonym is opposite of, all right? Same here, will be destroyed, will flourish. That's antonym. Destroy and flourish are opposite words, all right? So whenever you see that, when a passage, when a verse looks similar, but then you see, oh, but these words are opposite to each other, they're antonyms, then you need to think, oh, this is contrastive, all right? Any questions? Okay, Proverbs 13, verse 3. All right, here, Pastor Arn, can you point out to us the words that are connected here?
Proverbs 13, verse 3, the one who guards his mouth preserves his life. The one who opens wide his lips comes to ruin. The subject, the one, and the second line, the one.
Okay, yeah.
Then the verbal word guards and opens wide. Who guards and opens.
Okay, who guards and who opens wide. Yeah, okay, good.
And then his mouth and his lips.
Yes, notice those are similar to each other, right?
Okay. Preserves the verbal verb, preserves lives come, and then the next line is comes to ruin.
Okay. Oh. So what? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Contrastive, Pastor.
Yeah, what's being contrasted here? Notice the one who guards. So you have guards versus
guard and
opens wide. Those are opposite ideas, right? A guard is to protect, but opens wide is the opposite of that. Now, again, as I said, sometimes some of the lines will have synonyms, right? Because mouth and lips are similar, right?
Similar, yes, synonyms.
So those aren't opposite in that case, but not everything has to be opposite. But now, preserves his life preserves his life and comes to ruin. Are those equal?
Comes to ruin, antonyms.
Yes, very good. They're opposite, right? To preserve your life is the opposite of, causing your life to go to ruin. Okay, so here, again, we have an antonym and we have an antonym. So again, notice, now mouth and lips, those would be a synonym. And that's okay, because as we saw in the previous verse, we had the house and the tent. Those are similar. But the contrast is being the tent, the house of the wicked, the tent of the upright. So it's going to contrast each of these two people. And in Proverbs 13, it's going to contrast the one who guards his mouth versus the one who opens wide his lips. All right. And notice here, the translation did not put the word but. Okay. So you don't have to have the word but for it to be a contrast. Just the idea. Obviously, these two lines contrast each other. Does that make sense? I don't want you to be confused. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I got it, Pastor.
Okay. Yeah, I just didn't want you guys to be confused with there being actually being a synonym here, because you might well say, wait a minute, I thought these are contrastive. Yes, it's the idea in each line that's being contrasted. All right, and it's two people being contrasted. One person guards his mouth, the other opens wide his lips. That's the contrast. Whereas if you go back up to the synonymous, notice it's the evil and the wicked. Those are synonymous. Will bow down in each line. That's synonymous. Before the good, at the gates of the righteous. That's synonymous. So in a synonymous parallel passage, they're all synonymous. Okay? But in a contrastive, there'll be parts of those two lines that contrast, but not the whole line. So the house and the tent, yes, those are synonyms, and that's okay. But the rest of the line is being contrasted, the wicked and the upright, destroyed and flourish. So that's what you want to pay attention to is notice, is every single part of both lines synonymous, or is there some opposites, some antonyms there? And that's what we see in this example. Okay. Now, for the more challenging ones, so synonymous and contrastive, usually those are easier to spot. The developmental, that's the third kind of parallelism. That one is more difficult at times to see and to understand. All right, so remember there's three kinds of developmental parallelism. That is where the second line develops, or one line develops the other. All right, so they're not synonymous and they're not contrastive, but one line is developing the other in some way. And one way that it develops it is by expanding or adding to the idea. So basically that the second line gives more information. It's still related to the first line, but in this case, it's adding more information. So in this case, the heart knows its own bitterness, and a stranger does not share its joy. So the second line here is adding to the first, or expanding on it. Notice we don't have synonymous synonyms here. Look, the heart is the subject of the first line, right? But that's not the same as a stranger. Those are two different things. They're not synonymous, and they're not opposite either. Okay? The heart knows its own bitterness, so the verb is knows, but does not share is not equivalent to knows. Okay? Its own bitterness, you have bitterness and joy. Well, those are opposites, but that's the only part that's opposite. The rest of this, if we look at it, we're just saying, oh, you know what? Line 2 is adding more information to line 1. Because notice, the heart knows its own bitterness. A stranger does not share its joy. So a stranger, that's somebody else. That's another person. So here we have to, okay, this is adding information in the second line to the first. Okay, it doesn't have any of the features like in the synonymous or contrastive where we have, notice these parallel statements that it's grammatically equivalent. In this passage, Proverbs 14, we don't have that. Now, if it had said, and the bowels, you know, do not share its joy, that may be more, that's expressing now more a synonymous idea, because now the subject are synonyms. Okay? But that's not what this passage said. It's the subject is a stranger. So this is some new added information. Okay? So that's called expansion or addition. You'll see it, either one of those words. So we say this is developmental parallelism, and the form of developmental is expansion. Expansion. Or you could say addition. A second type, so this is the first type. A second type is of developmental is explanation or illustration. That is where one line explains or illustrates another. So here we have an example. As the deer pants for the water brooks, so my soul pants for you. Now notice we have pants. Pants, that's the idea of longs for. The subject is deer in the first line. It's my soul in the second line. So those aren't synonymous, right? For the water brooks in the first line. For you, O God, in the second line. Okay, those aren't synonymous either. But notice it's the same verb, pants. But what's going on here is the first line is an illustration. It's giving a picture, right? Just like a deer desires water. That's an illustration of my soul pants for you, O God. So he's explaining, he's giving a picture of what he's trying to express here. My soul pants for you, O God. And so it's an illustration is like the deer that pants for water. And he could have said it this way too. My soul pants for you, O God, like the deer pants for the water brooks. All right, that would be the same thing, just reversed, but still, in this case, line 2 would illustrate line 1. But sometimes the poet will flip that and he'll put the illustration or the application in the first line. Okay, so just be aware of that. Any questions on that? Okay, so keep an eye for that. So you have developmental expansion, where one line adds information to the other. You have developmental explanation or illustration, where one line illustrates the other or explains it. And then there's a third type of developmental parallelism, and that is where one line gives the reason or the result of the other. Leave the presence of a fool or you will not discern words of knowledge. So notice he gives a statement in the first line, leave the presence of a fool. And the second line answers the question why, or what will happen if you don't. Okay, it gives a result or a reason in this case. All right, you could word it this way. If you don't leave the presence of a fool, you will not discern words of knowledge. Okay, so the second line is giving a reason for the first. Okay, so those are the three types of developmental. We have expansion, we have explanation, and we have reason or result. Okay, so those are the three types of developmental. Let me do one example here, one more example, and then I'm going to give you guys some examples in a minute, just as a way of review. The beginning of strife is like letting out water. So abandon the quarrel before it breaks out. So notice here, again, this is developmental, a reason. The second line gives the reason for the first. Okay? Or in this case, sorry, line 1 gives the reason for line 2. The instruction is abandon the quarrel before it breaks out. Why? What's the reason? Because the beginning of strife is like letting out water. It's almost an illustration there too. Okay, notice the conjunction so. That often will so or. Notice so. That often indicates a developmental parallelism happening. Okay. All right, so those are three of the most common forms of parallelism. Now, there's a special form of synonymous or sometimes contrastive parallelism where the second line is in reverse order compared to the first. It's synonymous or contrastive, but also there's this other element called chiasm. And if you remember, chiasm is where basically the second line is written in reverse compared to the first. We see an example of this in Psalm 51. Be gracious to me, O God, according to your loving kindness. And then the second line begins with, according to the greatness of your compassion, blot out my transgressions. Okay? So notice how the second line is in reverse order compared to the first. So that's called a chiasm, and that highlights what's written in the middle of the chiasm. So in this case, chiasm is used for emphasis, and it is focusing attention in this verse on the loving kindness and compassion of God. So that's being emphasized. And the author is showing us this emphasis by reversing the second line. So it's an intentional thing the author does in order to convey that emphasis. All right. So that's why it's important to see these. This isn't just some academic exercise where, you know, you're trying to find the, you know, look for the chiasm in this passage, you know. Really, the reason you want to do it is, as the preacher, you want to know if he uses a chiasm, then that means he's actually expressing emotion and emphasis. He's doing it on purpose. It's like if you were to write down something and you put an exclamation point or you underline it or you circle it, right? You're trying to draw attention to that by adding in those extra marks, right? So in a way, that's what the poet is doing with chiasm, is he's sort of circling that part of the passage to draw more attention to it. So that's important. There are other techniques that poets use in order to bring emphasis, like repetition or the use of exclamations like behold or look or whoa or those kind of things. But also chiasm is a way that they express emphasis as well. All right. And then finally, there's one other, sometimes it's just too hard to tell if there is parallelism being used. And if so, what kind? So some people call it formal or miscellaneous. We gave it the name but, right? And that is basically where the connection between the two lines is unclear. So we just say but. I have no idea. I don't know what it is. Okay. So that happens at times as well, where it's not clear. So you just say, I'm not sure. And that's fine. Don't want to force it. Okay, so those are the 5 types of parallelism. We have synonymous, we have contrastive, we have developmental, which there are 3 kinds, right? Expansion, explanation, and reason or result. Okay. And then we have chiasm, which is really a special form of the synonymous or contrastive. All right. And then, of course, we have but. Don't know. Okay. All right. So that's just a quick review. We're going to do some exercises in a moment, but any questions on that before we do some exercises together? Hopefully that stirs your memories, I hope, a little bit.
Sir Tim.
Yeah, Alan.
Can we have some examples of formal
oh, sure.
parallelism?
We had one in let me see. Okay, let me just show you one passage here. Psalm 128, that's an example that we used in the assignment 3.8, I think. The last line, indeed, may you see your children's children, peace be upon Israel. Those 2 thoughts don't seem to have an obvious connection to each other. Okay, they fit the stanza. The whole stanza is a form of, it's a prayer, really, asking God to bless from Zion, asking God to see the prosperity of Jerusalem, asking God to see your children's children, and asking God to bring peace upon Israel. So all 4 of these lines are prayer requests to the Lord, but how the 2 lines in verse 6 connect to each other is not very clear. So to me, I didn't know. I just put but for this one because I didn't see the clear connection. The other 5 verses it did. I mean, so that to me was one example of a formal, or basically I don't know how they're connected. Again, all 4 of these lines in the stanza, we know how they're connected just generally. They're all part of a prayer request of the psalmist for the Lord to bring blessing upon the city and the nation. But as far as how may you see your children's children and peace be upon Israel, those don't have a clear connection, in my opinion. So my experience with this, normally if you're in the Proverbs or the Psalms, is maybe 1 out of 10 verses, 1 out of 15 might be unclear, something like that. All right, so most of the time, 90% of the time, you should be able to identify. There should be a clear connection between the 2 lines, either synonymous, contrastive, developmental. But maybe, like I said, every so often you'll come across a verse that maybe it's not clear. Okay.
Pastor Tim,
Yeah, Sid.
how can we integrate that in our sermon in the preparation and delivery if we cannot, we will do ambot?
Just tell them, this verse is ambut, and skip it. No, that's a great question. But as I mentioned in that last example, and this is where we do the parallelism. Pull that back up. So you go through and you'll notice the parallelism in each line. And yeah, the last line, let's say you do your study and you go, I'm not sure what kind of parallelism this is. That's okay, because still, like I said, you know the theme of the stanza. And so you can still, as you explain or preach the passage, you can still make connections to each of the particular statements he gives in the stanza. Right? So basically here I would say, so notice in this stanza, essentially the psalmist gives 4 prayer requests. The first prayer request is that the Lord would bless the man who fears the Lord, that he would bless him from Zion. That's a specific reference to the temple, right? The temple area. And then the second request is he asks of the Lord that that the man who fears the Lord would see the blessing upon Jerusalem, that he would experience that blessing in the city. And then the third request is that God would bless this man, that he would see his grandchildren, his apos. And then the fourth prayer request is for peace or shalom to be on Israel. And then you can explain each of those and how they're all related to the theme of the stanza. Just like you will in verses 1 to 4. These are all connected to the theme of the stanza, the man who fears the Lord, and how God blesses his life and his home. So even if you don't see the parallelism there, it's okay, because you still should be able to see, well, how is this verse connected to the psalm? All right. And just preach that. Another thing that, remember, we do in our study of a poem is we also do diagramming. And so the block diagram will also show relationships potentially between the verses. So you'll see the logical relationship between the verses, the grammatical relationship, but sometimes you may not see the particular relationship within the verse, but that's okay. As long as you're able to understand, how does this verse connect to the stanza? How does it connect to the whole poem? Did that answer your question? Make sense? Okay. So parallelism, what that does is usually just adds to our insight into what the poet is doing within the poem. So for example, like in Psalm 51, there's a lot of chiasms in that psalm. I can't remember exactly, but it seems like there were 8 or 9 verses in that psalm that were chiasms. What does that tell you? Well, if you have a psalm with a lot of chiasms in it, that's telling you there's a lot of emotion in that psalm. A lot of emphasis, a lot of exclamation points are in that psalm. So that helps you to understand, as you preach that psalm, Psalm 51, there needs to be passion and emotion in it as you preach it, because that's how it was given by the original author, David. So, or if you're in a psalm, usually like a wisdom psalm, you're going to see a lot of developmental parallelism, okay, because it's going to be more instructive. All right. In a praise psalm, you're probably going to see a lot more synonymous parallelism, because there's going to be repetition of expressions of praise. Sometimes parallelism can be helpful if you see a pattern where, say, all the verses in the psalm are developmental except one that's synonymous. And the author may have done that on purpose to draw attention to that verse. So that's one thing to look for, is patterns as well. Or does the author typically use one kind of parallelism throughout the psalm? Or some psalms you'll see certain kind of parallelism used in the first part of the psalm and another kind used in the second part. All right. And sometimes there isn't any obvious patterns as well. But it's just what we're trying to do is just keep observing and looking for things, because sometimes the author will put something there intentionally to direct our attention. Like I said, putting in a chiasm. Maybe you'll have a poem where there's just one chiasm, and that verse, maybe there's something about that verse the author wants to draw special attention to within the psalm. So it's like every piece, whether it's parallelism, whether it's certain kinds of figurative language, whether it's just in the diagram, the structure of the poem, all of these give us information that helps us be able to interpret the psalm overall. We're just trying to gather information from different points of view in order to give us the best understanding possible of what the author's trying to say in that psalm. Okay? Now, not every poem is going to have, some poems don't have that much figurative language. Some poems have a lot of figurative language. Some poems will use, have a pattern in the parallelism. Other poems will not. There's another structure we've talked about before called acrostics. Do you remember that? Where each line in the poem starts with the first letter is the next letter in the Hebrew alphabet, right? And so like Psalm 119 or Proverbs 31, there are some passages where the poet intentionally uses that kind of a structure. So there's just different ways that the poets will use different types of characteristics or tools in order to express either the structure of the poem, express emphasis in the poem, express emotion in the poem, instruction. So we just have to look for those things. Just like when we communicate, sometimes we will raise our voice for emphasis, right? Other times we may repeat something because we want to make the point clear, or we want to focus on the point, or we want to give the idea that this is the main point. So we might repeat it several times. So we also use different techniques in order to draw attention to our hearers or our readers to what we're trying to communicate. So the psalmist will do that too in different ways. All right, long answer to your short question, Sid, but is that any other questions or follow up to that? Does that make sense? Okay, well, let's do a few examples before we look at the actual assignment. These are the steps for parallelism analysis of a poem. First, you want to identify how many lines are in the verse. Normally, there are 2 lines or bicola, sometimes 3 lines, and then sometimes there are more than 3 lines. Remember, we called those Coca-Cola, right? So you have bicola, tricola, or Coca-Cola. So you want to first identify, because if you have 3 lines, then you're going to need to consider parallelism between not just lines 1 and 2, but also line 3. So that's why we want to clarify, make sure how many lines are in this verse. Again, the more typical is 2 lines, especially in the Proverbs, but not always. So first, identify how many lines, and there, just follow the translation. How many lines do you see in the translation? I would say the best ones to use, these are the best translations to use for this. They do a pretty good job of correctly identifying how many lines in a verse. And I think I showed you a long time ago. In the Hebrew text, there are accent markers which indicate, which divide up the lines in a verse. And so these translations generally do a good job of noticing that. So identify how many lines, that's the first in each verse. And then second is identify the type of parallelism, which we just talked about. Indicate, is it synonymous, contrastive, or developmental, or formal, unknown, say but. All right. Then the third step is compare the type of parallelism with the poem. So note any patterns in that. So you basically look at the parallelism and see, does there seem to be a pattern here? Is it mostly one kind of parallelism, or is it random seemingly, or look for patterns? There may or may not be some in the poem, but just look to see. Okay. All right. Well, let's go through an example together, and we'll do Proverbs. We'll do the example from Proverbs, the passage that I use from Proverbs to do that. So I'm just going to give each of you guys a line. You can read it, think about it for a minute, and then see if you can identify. Well, in this case, all we're going to do is identify the number of lines in here. This should be relatively easy to do. So identify the number of lines and then the type of parallelism. All right. So we'll start with Virilio. Can you do the first one here? How many lines are there? And then what's the type of parallelism?
This one, sir.
Yeah.
Hear my son, your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching.
So how many lines?
2 lines, sir.
Yep. That's the easy part. All right.
Yeah.
Now, what kind of parallelism is this? What does it look like to you? Just if you had to guess.
I'm confused, sir, because the upper line is a single line, father's instruction and mother's teaching.
Okay, so
there is an ellipsis here, my son, and second line. Here, my son, your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching. My son, do not forsake your mother's teaching.
Yeah, both lines are addressed to my son, but he just normally you won't see them repeat that. It's assumed that both of these lines are directed towards my son. But notice the thing that sticks out to me first is your father's and your mother's.
Yep.
Your father's instruction and your mother's teaching.
And teaching and instruction.
Yeah, so
that's why I'm confused. Your father and mother.
Yeah, so, but it's similar, right? He's speaking about the parent. Yes. And in here,
I think so, in synonymous, sir.
That's what I would guess. And I would guess that for 2 reasons. One, notice your father's instruction, your mother's teaching. That's the same idea, right? And he's basically telling his son to do the same thing. Hear your father's instruction. Do not forsake your mother's teaching. That's the same idea, right?
Yes, sir.
Basically follow it. Okay? So it's not an exact synonym, but it's a similar idea. And it's given in the same form. A command, hear your father's instruction. Another command, do not forsake your mother's teaching. All right? So it's grammatically the same, right? You have a command and then the object of the command, and then you have both lines telling the son to follow or obey, right? They're conveying the same idea. You guys see that? Berlio, does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Now, if he had said, hear my son, your father's instruction, and your mother will be blessed if you obey. Okay, now here it's not parallel or not synonymous, because notice the subject's different now. See, different subject. The subject in the first line is you, right? You here, or my son, right? But this second line here, the subject is mother. You see that?
Yes, sir.
So in the original, let's do this. All right, now in the original verse, the subject is also still you. And the object is your father's instruction. Here, I'll do it this way. I don't know how to make this clear. All right, we'll do it this way. All right, so the subject is you. And then this is the object here, your father's instruction. And in this second line, the subject is still you, it's command, and the object is your mother's instruction. Now in this second example, let's say the second line was, and your mother will be blessed if you obey. In this one, here, the subject is you, the object is your father's instruction, but in the second line, the subject is mother. And the object, there is no object, it's will be blessed. So this is the predicate adjective, if you guys remember that stuff from a long time ago when we talked about grammar. But it's different. It's grammatically not the same. So in the second example, this would be developmental expansion. It's adding information to the first line. Whereas in the actual passage here, it's synonymous. He's expressing a similar idea in each line. Both lines have the same subject. Both lines have a verb that is a command, right? But and then both have a similar object. But in the second example, if the passage had been this way, notice the verb here is a command in the first line. But in the second line, the verb is not a command, it's indicative. It's making a statement. Okay? Remember I told you, a characteristic of synonymous or contrastive parallelism is that it'll be grammatically similar, each line. And here it's not. Okay? I hope I didn't overcomplicate that. Does that make sense, guys? Can you see the difference? Okay. Berlio, that make sense?
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, good. But you notice synonymous by seeing your father's instruction, your mother's teaching. That tells you, okay, these seem similar, all right? And they are. Hear and do not forsake are just two different ways of saying obey or follow. Okay? So it is a similar idea. All right, good. Let me ask Sid, do you want to do the next one here? Verse 9. How many lines and what kind of parallelism?
Indeed, they are a graceful wreath to your head and ornaments about your neck. 2 lines.
Yep, 2 lines. What kind of parallelism?
Synonymous.
Synonymous. All right.
Wreath
tells you
and
that?
ornament. Wreath and ornament.
Okay, good. Wreath, ornaments.
How about
Okay, that's all I can find.
Okay, how about your head and your neck? All right. Those aren't the exact same thing, but it's in the similar area, right?
There's part of your body.
Yeah, the upper part, right? Your neck and your head. And then notice here, they are graceful. All right, is in the first line. We don't see anything similar in a second. Well, why is that?
Ellipsis.
Yes. What should be there? What's implied? What's
They
missing?
are graceful ornament.
Yeah,
They are graceful ornament. They are
Yeah,
graceful ornament.
They are graceful. Okay. Because notice by itself, if it's just an ornaments about your neck, it's like, well, what does that mean? There needs to be, well, it's implied that they are graceful ornaments about your neck. All right. Again, head and neck is not the same thing, but it's a similar idea. Okay. That's what we're looking for. Synonymous, we're looking for similar or same. Okay. And that's what we have here. Just like up here, your father's instruction, well, that's your father and your mother are different people, but it's the same idea. He's talking about your parents and what they teach you, what they instruct you in. So that's a similar idea. Hear and do not forsake. Those are different verbs, but they convey a similar idea. That's what we're looking for. Synonymous, similar. All right, good. Questions on this one?
Pastor Tim, the preposition about is having the idea of around.
Yeah.
So your head is being put with wreath. That's around your head. And that ornament also is around your neck. It's like a garland.
Good. Exactly. So that's even more similar picture, right? Something around your head. A wreath goes around your head. And ornament goes around your neck. So it's exactly, that's even reinforces the synonymous or similar nature of each of these two lines. So good observation. All right. Kazot, I'm going to give you line verse 10 here.
My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent.
What do you think here? How many lines first do we see?
Two lines. 2
lines, yep. Now notice, does this seem to be synonymous?
Developmental.
Yeah, it's developmental, isn't it? Notice there's not, what kind of developmental?
Reason.
Reason?
Oh, my son, do not consent. A command.
Yeah, it is a command. But is he giving a reason here? Or is he just expanding on the first line?
Expansion.
Yeah, I think it's expansion.
Expansion.
Because he says, if sinners entice you, and then the rest of the line is the more information. If they entice you, don't consent. Now notice here, it's not synonymous because the first line, right, is an interrogative. It's a question being asked, or a condition. And the verb is indicative. Okay, but in the second line, notice the verb is an imperative. Okay, the first line, if sinners entice you, right, the subject is sinners. All right, but the second line, the subject is you, referring to the son. All right. So you notice there that these, even grammatically, they're not the same. All right, so it's definitely not synonymous. And yeah, developmental, because the second line gives more, expands upon the first. Any questions on this? Okay, good, very good. James, I'm going to give you the third one here. Or sorry, the verse 11. Are you there, James? Oh, maybe he stepped out a minute. Alex, how about you? Are you there? I think I can hear you, Alex. Oh, maybe the signal's not good. Yeah, can't quite hear you, brother. I know Alex mentioned there were some storms there, so maybe the signals. We'll just go to Alan then, because I know I can hear him. Alan, why don't you just go ahead and take this one, verse 11. First, how many lines? Oh, go ahead and read. I'm sorry.
If they say, come with us, let us lie in wait for blood. Let us ambush the innocent without cause. 3 lines.
Okay, 3 lines. Now, before you go on, I just want to point out, now this is from the New American Standard Version, all right? The New American Standard had 3 lines. Now, let's say you were studying the ESV. The ESV actually had 2 lines. All right? So the ESV has 2 lines. Well, that can affect how you do the parallelism. But then what I've mentioned in the past is when you do this parallelism, when you identify the lines, you want to check, if you can, look at these 3 translations. I mentioned they were the good ones to use. Look at the New American Standard, or now the LSB, the ESV, and the New King James. And then what you need to do is just compare and look and see, are they the same number of lines? Sometimes there will be a difference. As for example, here, the New American Standard has 3 lines. The ESV has 2 lines. So which is it? Which is the correct one? Well, what I've told you to do is, in this case, also compare the New King James. And basically take the number of lines that is the majority. So for example, in this case, notice how many lines are in the New King James?
3.
3. And we have 3 lines in the New American Standard. So basically the majority wins. Just go with the 3 lines. All right. I have found when there is a difference, normally when 2 of these 3 translations agree, that's probably the correct answer. But you want to compare just to make sure. So before you, in the first part of the assignment, when you identify the number of lines, do it in your translation, but then check the other 2, the ESV and the New King James, to see what they did and look for any differences in the number of lines. All right. Sometimes, like in this case, there are 2. And why I mention that is because when we go through this passage in Proverbs, notice something. They're all going to be 2 lines. Okay. That's normal in Proverbs. So when we got to verse 11, all these other verses are 2 lines, but we get to verse 11 and say, wait a minute, it's 3 lines. Is that right? Shouldn't it be 2 lines? Because all the other verses are. And then if you're reading the ESV, you wouldn't even notice. It would be 2 lines. You wouldn't even know that it could be 3. So that's why I say first, count the number of lines in your translation. Then go and look at the other 2 and just do a quick comparison. Okay, they're same. Oh, look, verse 11 is different. Oh, but then New King James, verse 11 is also 3 lines. So that is the likely correct answer is the 3 lines. And the reason this is important is it'll make a difference. If you were to do 2 lines versus 3 lines, you're going to come up with a different result in the parallelism analysis. So that's why I want you to compare the other translations. Just looking at the number of lines. You don't have to compare the parallelism used. Just we want to first identify what is the correct number of lines in this translation, or which translation is correct. Does that make sense?
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah.
What if, sir, even if the majority is NASB and NKJV are similar, then I choose ESV. It seems that I am convinced with the translation.
Well, for the number,
with the grammar of ESV.
Yeah, well, the problem is the number of lines comes from the Hebrew accents. So unless you understand Hebrew accents, then, you know, you won't be able to say which one is correct. You'll have to rely on these 3 translations.
Yes.
Okay. Unless you study Hebrew accents, and then you can go look at the Hebrew text and then see the accent markers and know where to divide it. That's more complicated. So it would take a while for you to learn to do that. You certainly can learn that if you want, but what I'm suggesting is if you don't want to have to try to learn the Hebrew, is just follow these translations. Now, I'm not saying in terms of interpretation, okay? But in terms of parallelism, you want to have the right number of lines, and you want that number of lines to match what the original author intended. And that original author intention is expressed by the Hebrew accents in the Hebrew Bible. Does that answer your question, Brilio, or are you asking something else?
Thank you, sir. I understand. It
Okay.
seems that for me, I'm comfortable with the ESV.
Yeah.
but as you have said, majority wins. Then it's better.
I thought you're going to say, I surrender to the scholars.
Yeah, and ESV is very good. And there are times where the ESV has the correct number and the New American Standard does not. So what we want to do though is, this is just looking at the number of lines. So I'm not telling you use the other translation. What this would mean is this. Let's say you're using the ESV, okay? And then you see, okay, 2 lines. Well, then when you go and check the other translations, you say, oh, it should be 3 lines. So what you do is then just use the ESV translation, but make it 3 lines, okay? To match what the Hebrew text says. So you can still use the ESV, but just make sure that it's not 2 lines that are being, the original text is not 2 lines, it's 3 lines. Okay, but you can use ESV translation. Stay with the translation. Just note that, okay, this should be 3 lines. So you can make that correction yourself. Okay. All right. So all that said, Helen, 3 lines.
3 lines and
what's the, so how do we do this then? If we have 3 lines, how do we do the parallelism? What are we comparing?
if they say, "Come with us, let us lie in wait for blood, let us ambush the innocent without cause." I think this is developmental.
Okay, which lines though? Lines 1 and 2, lines 2 and 3, line.
Come with us, line 1.
Okay.
And next is let us lie in wait for blood. Let us ambush the innocent without cause. The next 2 lines develop the first line.
Okay, very good. So lines 2 and 3 develop line 1.
They added.
Yes, expansion or addition.
Yes.
Yeah, either one, same thing. Good. Okay, and then what about, notice line 2 and 3. Do they have a relationship, you think?
Let us lie.
So let's look at those a second. I'll just split them off here. All right. Let me do this. Notice, let us. Okay,
Let
so
us.
we have the same subject, us, lie in wait, ambush. Green. And now for blood and innocent without cause, that's a little bit different.
Yeah.
But I think it's the same idea, right?
Yes.
Lie in wait for blood, ambush. So to me, this is line 2 and 3 seem to be synonymous because it seems to be expressing a similar idea. What do you think, Alan?
Yes, yes. Because the intention there is to harm the innocent.
Yes. And really in a sneaky way, right? Ambush or lie in wait.
Lie in wait.
Like hiding, getting ready to bring harm. So that's why I would say that their 2 lines are presenting a similar idea, and even the grammar is very similar. Let us lie in wait. Let us ambush. Okay. But here I wanted you to see also that lines 2 and 3 together are developing line 1. All right, any questions? Can you guys see that? Does that make sense? If you have more than 2 lines, the parallelism is a little bit more complicated. So you have to look at different combinations. Like Alan did here, where lines 2 and 3 together develop line 1. Or you could say it this way. Line 2 develops line 1. And then you could say line 3 develops line 1. You could also say it that way. Okay, either of these ways is correct. All right. All right, let's see, where are we at? James, are you back yet? Are you there? All right, can you do verse 12 here? First, identify the number of lines, and then what kind of parallelism here?
Okay.
You can read the verse, Chris.
Let us swallow them alive like Sheol, even whole as those who go down to the pit. 2 lines are fulfilled.
Yep, 2 lines. What kind of parallelism?
What is this? This is line 1 is what is that? Developmental to line 2.
Line 1 is what to line 2?
Developmental asserted.
Yeah, I think developmental. What kind?
Developmental.
How does line 2 develop line 1?
I don't know.
You have three possibilities. You can just guess: expansion or explanation or result, reason result.
Expansion.
Yeah, that's probably a good guess. Yeah, that's probably it. Line 2 develops line 1 by expansion. Adding more information. Swallow them alive, swallow them whole.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Now, some may say, well, is this synonymous? Because Sheol and the pit are similar. You know, like Sheol, as those, and then let us swallow. You know, seems to be same idea, right? So maybe synonymous, but it's different enough to me, because here it says swallow them alive like Sheol swallows, or as those who go down to the pit is a little bit different, but you could do that. If you're not sure, you can say synonymous, question mark.
Pastor Tim,
Yeah.
Pastor Tim, the presence of the word even, it will give you an explanation for result.
Yeah, that's a good point. You know, notice the word even. Okay, so that's a good point to maybe indicate more the idea of developmental. All right, good. Let's see, Kazo, why don't you try verse 13? You're muted.
We will find all kinds of precious wealth. We will fill our houses with spoil.
How many lines?
2 lines.
Yeah. All right, what kind of parallelism do you think?
Developmental.
Okay, in what way?
Expansion.
Okay, let's take a look. Notice, okay, we, and then he says, we'll find, we'll fill, and then notice precious wealth and spoil. So it almost looks more synonymous to me than developmental. It's making two statements. But, you know, synonymous could be because you have find and then fill. And then does add houses. So, yeah, maybe developmental is probably a better makes more sense. Because find and fill are a little different. I don't know. Anybody else have any opinions about this one?
Yes, it looks expansion because it adds to the idea of finding, and then after finding, filling, something like that. It expands the idea.
Now, the one thing that would move me towards developmental is what I've also recommended that you guys do is check the interlinear. Because let me do that, show you that. Because remember the word order, and what I did is I looked at, here, we'll look over here at, oh, here, let's do this first. Pull this here. Take a look with me, okay? Remember, go to Bible Hub, BibleHub.com, okay? And then we go to select a passage, Proverbs, in this case 1. We want to do interlinear, so find interlinear. Here, let me expand this a little bit. Okay, and now we want to click for the chapter because I want to go down to Proverbs 1, verse 13. Okay, now notice here, all kinds. So remember in the interlinear, the middle line, that's the actual Hebrew text. And then right below it is the literal translation of each word. So notice here, what does it say? Literally, all possessions, precious, we shall find. Okay, now notice the next line. We shall fill our houses with spoil. What does that look like? All possessions we shall find, we shall fill our houses with spoil. It looks like the second line is reversed compared to the first, doesn't it? This looks like a chiasm here. Let me write it out for you. Here. Oh, I didn't put it there. Sorry, guys. Here, I'll just cut and paste it. This is what the word order would look like. All kinds of precious wealth we will find. We will fill our houses with spoil. And literally, it's all possessions, precious, we shall find. So notice even the first word is possessions, all possessions. And then the last word is spoil. Okay, so the object, so that the parallelism here is it starts with an object, and then you have the subject and the verb, and then you have subject and the verb, and then object. Okay, so it looks like a chiasm here where the emphasis is on find and fill. You guys see that? Now, how would you know this? Because the English translation just has we will find and we will fill. It doesn't look like a chiasm in English, but that's what you're going to need to do when you do the parallelism is go look at the interlinear and just follow the word order there in the interlinear.
So, Pastor Tim,
yeah,
before we will have conclusion, we need to look at the interlinear first.
I think that would be a good idea because the English translation does not always follow the word order of the Hebrew text. And how do we know what the word order of the Hebrew text? Well, the only way to know is go to the interlinear because that gives you the exact order of the words in Hebrew. And then you can look at the English translation of each word. You don't have to know Hebrew to use the interlinear, and it'll show you. So in this example, it is all possessions, precious, we will find, we will fill our houses with spoil. So there we see in the interlinear, we see the exact word order of the Hebrew text, and it looks like it flips around. The first line has the subject and verb at the end. The second line has the subject and verb at the beginning. All right. Yeah, otherwise you wouldn't know that from the English translation. Sometimes the English translations will show the chiasm. They'll follow the word order, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes they just make it sound correct in English. That's why I'm not a big fan of a lot of the translations of the Psalms, because they often don't do a good job of recognizing these poetic devices or these types of structure. Really, a good translation of this poem would reflect the chiasm. Okay? But a lot of the guys that do translation work in the poetry don't always, they focus more on the words and the accuracy of the words rather than also the order of the words. Sometimes they do a good job, but sometimes they don't. So that's why I always recommend go to interlinear. For example, let me do verse 16. I'll show you another example. We'll have to wrap it up here, but let me show you. I'll do an example for you. Verse 16. For, speaking of the wicked that he talked about earlier, for their feet run to evil and they hasten to shed blood. Okay, 2 lines, which is the same in the ESV and the King James. Now, this parallelism here, notice to evil, to shed blood, their feet run, they hasten. Okay, same subjects. The verb run and hasten, those are similar. To evil and to shed blood, that's similar as well. So I think this is a synonymous parallelism. Same ideas being expressed. But then I go, okay, so I check that now. Let me go to the interlinear and just make sure that, let me check the word order here and make sure that there's nothing, let me see, just make sure that I check the word order. So go to the interlinear, verse 16, for their feet to evil run, they make haste to shed blood. Notice line 1 ends with the verb run. Line 2 begins with the verb make haste. Okay, so if I were to write that out literally here, I would have this. This would be the word order in English following the Hebrew word order. Their feet to evil they run, and they hasten to shed blood. Okay, so notice the subject and verb are in the center. They reverse, the poet reverses the second line compared to the first, so that the action is being emphasized here. Now notice the English translation doesn't show that. It does the subject and the verb, subject, verb. But in the Hebrew, it's actually their feet to evil, they run. So the subject verb is at the end of the first line, and the subject and verb is at the beginning of the second line. So again, we have a chiasm here. All right, and we don't see that in the English translation. We have to go to the interlinear to point that out. Again, why does this matter? Why is this important? Because as you look to this verse, you're going to see there's emphasis on the verbs. There's emphasis on the action. Their feet run to evil. They hasten to shed blood. It's like they're excited. They have to do this. And so they run and they hasten. And so that's the emphasis here in this verse. They want to do this evil thing. They want to commit violence. They're in a hurry. They're running. All right. So I know that the Solomon in this case is emphasizing to his son the danger of these wicked people and saying, look, this is how you know they're wicked. They're excited. They want to commit evil and do violence. And so when I explain this passage, I will give emphasis to that idea because Solomon does. All right. Okay, so I will put, you will have the examples here. Let me show you. Where is it? Parallelism. All right. So for the assignment, this is what we have here. This is what's posted on Canvas, all right, for assignment 316. Parallelism analysis for your assigned Proverbs passage, all right? So if you go on the Canvas, you'll have this example. This is your assignment that you'll download. And again, it provides the instruction, and we just went through those steps here this morning. An example, and we did some of the verses from this example. You'll have all of them here, okay? And then shows that identify the number of lines and identify the parallelism. So I have that here. And then compare. So the third step is just, all right, I just rewrite all the types of parallelism, and then I just make a comment if there's any pattern. In this case, in Proverbs 1, I just said of the 12 verses, half are synonymous, half are developmental with no apparent pattern. I did say, though, all of the developmental parallelism is expansion except the last verse in the stanza, which is result. That could be intentional. All right.
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah.
In this parallelism, sir, parallelism, it's hard to pronounce.
You're doing fine.
Then doing this, sir, only to assign passage, like for example, Proverbs 3:1-8. We are not going to write the whole chapter.
Correct. Yes, just your assigned passage. That's why I put it
thank you,
here.
sir.
Parallelism analysis for your assigned passage.
Thank you, sir.
Now, if you want to do the whole chapter, you're welcome to do that. All right. But for the assignment, you don't have to. Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Good question. All right. So assignment 316 is the Proverbs parallelism. And some of you still need to do your parallelism analysis for your psalm. So that's assignment 3.8. Okay. So there I do an example from Psalm 128 and then give you space to do it for your assigned psalm. So you're all assigned, each of you are assigned a Psalms passage. So just do the parallelism for that. Okay. So I have a separate example for each one, for your Psalm passage, and then an example for the Proverbs passage. Okay, just to show you. But it's the same kind of assignment, all right, that you're going to do. Okay. Now, let me quickly just talk about the schedule. I want to make sure that, oh, that's not it. Where is it? What happened to it? Oh, it's covered. Okay, hold on a second here. All right, let's do this again. This one, there we go. Okay, let me just make a couple comments about the schedule. I sent this to you earlier today on Facebook, this message, but I just wanted to go through it quickly to make sure it made sense in case you had a question. I've given each of you a personal Facebook message, I think back a couple of weeks ago, of the assignments that you still need to complete for modules 1 to 3. And this is a priority. I'd like you to, some of you still have an assignment for module 1 or module 2 that needs to get done. I want you to finish those first, okay? Because when we get to our module 3 workshop, I want to have all of module 1 and 2 done, okay? So first and priority, focus on completing, if you have any written assignments from module 1 or module 2 to finish, do that first. And then upload them on Canvas, the canvas.instructure. Modules 1 and 2 are on that website, all right? So like if you have one of your, you didn't upload, or I didn't get one of your assignments from module 1 or 2, just first do the writing assignment, all right? Then some of you still have a sermon, either you still may have an epistle sermon to preach, or you have your narrative sermon still to preach. So that's the second thing I want you to focus on. Be ready to preach whatever sermons you have left from module 1 or 2. So, some of you have an Ephesians sermon to preach. Some of you still need to preach your narrative sermon or sermons. So I want you to prepare those to be ready to preach at module 3. Okay? Then you can focus on finishing the reading assignments for modules 1 and 2. Okay? So this is just modules 1 and 2. I want you to be done with your assignments by June 7th, and so that you have some time to get your sermons done by June 18th, because at the module 3 workshop, you'll preach whatever sermons you have remaining from either module 1 or 2. Okay? Because the goal is, at the module 3 workshop, I want us to finish everything from module 1 and 2, all the assignments and all the sermons. And I think there's time to do that. All right. Most of you have done a lot of your module 1 or 2 assignments, but there's just a few that some of you have left to do. All right. So work on completing 1 assignment a week. Now, there's a couple of you that have a few more assignments for Module 1 and 2, so you may need to consider trying to do 2 assignments per week so that you're done. All right, this is June 7th, so that's about 2 months from now. So I think there's time if you just apply yourself here as best you can, all right? I know this is Holy Week, so I know it will be hard this week, but do your best after Easter. All right, again, finish your Module 1 or 2 written assignments that have not yet been completed. Then if you have an epistle or narrative sermon that you still need to preach, prepare that. So write out the sermon so you're ready to preach when we gather at the Module 3 workshop, okay? And again, for each of you, I wrote in the Facebook message I sent you a couple weeks ago what assignments are still missing and what sermons you need to preach. Okay, and then, so once we've completed the Module 3 workshop, or once if you finish these assignments already, if you're finished Module 1 and 2, your sermon's done, then you can keep working on the Module 3 assignments, all right? Even though those aren't due until September or the end of August, don't wait. Just go ahead and you can keep working on those so that you're not way behind when we get to the next module, okay? So here's just the schedule sort of in a summary form. All right, so between now and May 24th, we're going to continue to review the Proverbs and Psalms assignments by Zoom each week. Then June 7th, you need to have completed Module 1 and 2 assignments, including your sermons. All right. Module 1 is Ephesians. Module 2 is the narratives. Okay, now some of you have already preached your narrative sermons on video and those are recorded. And I told you I had an issue with Canvas, so I'll have to regrade those sermons. But a couple of you, I couldn't access your narrative sermon. So I wrote that in the message to you. So you'll need to try to find that. If you can't, then unfortunately, you may need to re-preach it when we gather for Module 3. And I apologize for that, but see if you can find it. So by June 18th, have your sermons ready to preach for the Module 3 workshop if you have an epistle or narrative sermon. And then at Module 3 workshop, June 20 to 25, you will preach those sermons that are remaining. Again, sermons from Module 1 or 2, okay? And then, of course, the tuition will need to do that for Module 3. Then, after we're done with the Module 3 workshop, you can continue to work on your Psalms and Proverbs assignments for Module 3 so that in October, when we meet again, or late September for Module 5 or 4, you'll preach those the Psalm and Proverbs sermons at that time. All right? Okay, does this schedule make sense? I know I went over it before a couple weeks ago, but I wanted to just go over it again and give you the priority. I really want you to get your Module 1 and 2 assignments done, including any sermons that you still need to preach from those 2 modules. Okay? So just do your best. Like I said, for many of you, if you can just do an assignment a week, you'll be caught up there. Some of you may need to do more than 1 assignment a week to get caught up. But do what you can, all right? Because if we can get Module 1 and 2 assignments and sermons done at the Module 3 workshop, by then, we'll be in really good shape to be able to get back on track for Module 4. All right. Any questions on that? If you have any specific questions about your assignments, feel free to message me. And you can ask me about that. But I really think we have a good chance to catch up, even though with all that's happened, if you can follow this approach. Work on module 1 and 2 assignments first. Then if you have an epistle or narrative sermon you need to preach, just prepare the message, have it ready to preach when we gather for the module 3 workshop. Then in the module 3 workshop, you'll preach those sermons. We'll also look at module 3 assignments together. I'll review some of the important poetry and wisdom information, the opportunity to fellowship as well. So that'll be our focus for the module 3 workshop, to basically get caught up. Okay. Okay. Any final questions on anything that we covered this morning? I know, parallelism, very exciting. Okay, well, next week I will be at a conference, so we will not be gathering. I won't have class. We'll have class the following week on the 26th, okay? So no class on the 19th, next Tuesday, but we will have class on the following Tuesday, the 26th, okay? So in the meantime, again, after Easter celebration this Sunday, if you could be working on your assignments next week, try to get caught up, that would be great, all right? Okay, well, let me ask, Bredio, can you go ahead and close us in prayer if there's no other questions by anybody?